So I'm going to talk about glomerulonephritis in this video. Glomerulonephritis, if we just kind of break it down, is defined as acute inflammation of the kidney, typically caused by an immune response. So during the first part of your curriculum, very early on in host defense, host response, I painted the immune system in the role of the good guy, defending you from invaders that want to do you harm. But at the end of the day, this is still a powerful tool. And as, Marvel Comics have taught us, with great power comes great responsibility. And the immune system isn't always so responsible. So there are a vast array of diseases that may cause glomerulonephritis, and those will be covered by your pathology and pathophysiology discipline directors. I'm just here to tell you what the heck the immune system is doing to damage kidneys all over the place. So that's why I call this an immunologist's perspective. So let's talk a little bit more about what glomerulonephritis by the immune system actually means. So we're talking about inflammation, and anytime you're talking about inflammation, you are talking about the immune response. So immune mechanisms are going to underline almost all of the causes of glomerulonephritis. Diseases of the glomeruli are largely split into two camps. You've got primary glomerular diseases, and then you've got systemic diseases that result in glomerulonephritis. So in this case, in primary glomerular disease, what we're talking about is basically diseases where the target is the kidney. In secondary, the target could be somewhere else in the body, or it could be a systemic inflammatory response, but the kidneys are kind of taking the brunt of it, okay? So primary glomerular disease would include things like acute post-infectious glomerulonephritis, which is caused by immune complexes that form post-streptococcal infection. IgA nephropathy, which there is a separate video on. The IgA nephropathy video, I actually wrote it, but it was produced by osmosis in conjunction with our university. So if you watch that, I did still write it, so you're still hearing from me. So the post-infectious glomerulonephritis, the IgA nephropathy, also C3 glomerulonephritis. Remember, when patients have a C3 deficiency, they actually wind up with a buildup of immune complexes, and that can lead to their deposition within the glomeruli, which then, of course, leads to inflammation. The secondary systemic diseases kind of happen by accident, right? So lupus, the target isn't in the kidney. It's not like it's trying to attack the kidney. Just you have this buildup of immune complexes that are depositing there and leading to inflammation. Goodpasture syndrome, that one, we can see that kind of anywhere. We certainly see it in the lungs. Bacterial endocarditis related glomerulonephritis. So these are all sites that are secondary to the kidney that actually lead to inflammation within the glomeruli. So let's talk about basically the immune mechanism. So by now, you guys could actually probably figure this out yourself. And I thought about actually making you do it, but we just got back from summer vacation. So let's kind of do a walk down memory lane into the immune response, and then we can figure out where to go from there, okay? So whenever we're thinking about immune mechanisms, which can underline all of these, we need to think about how we get there. And the main way we get there is antibodies. Almost all of these glomerular effects are the work of antibodies. Antibodies responding to what they shouldn't or landing where they shouldn't. So you've got two main mechanisms. First, you've got deposition of circulating immune complexes. So the immune complex, remember, is an antibody binding to its antigen. Antibody plus antigen equals immune complex. Now, immune complexes should be cleared, but in some case they aren't, or they're too big, or there's too many of them for the body to clear them. When that happens, they get filtered through, right? And they wind up in these tight spaces that they can't get through. So you have this deposition of these circulating immune complexes, and they can wind up in a couple places. They can be at the outer surface of the glomerular basement membrane. So that means they're really big and they couldn't even get through, or they were able to get through the outer surface of the glomerular basement membrane, but then they couldn't get through the inner surface, okay, where the pores are smaller. They can also potentially cause deposition within the mesangial area, and all of those are going to lead to basically inflammation. And this can be a complement-mediated inflammation. It can also be a inflammatory cell-mediated inflammation. So like neutrophils are kind of a huge culprit for this, but other immune cells as well. Now, that's where the antibody bound its target outside the kidney. Now, what if the antibody is specific for a antigen that is found inside the kidney? So in this case, you could have antibodies that are against antigens on the podocytes or anti-glomerular basement membrane antibodies. So this would be something that we would see in some systemic autoimmune diseases, where literally the antibodies are reacting directly to antigens found in the kidney. In both cases, we're going to get antibody binding within the kidney. We're going to get it binding within the kidney in high amounts. And it's that high amount of antibody binding that's going to further lead to inflammation, again, through either complement-mediated or inflammatory cell-mediated inflammation. So when you think of this, I want you to just think of kind of ways this could potentially happen. So anytime you have an antibody, remember we have these couple portions of the antibody. So down here is your FAB fragment, your fragment of antigen binding. Up here is your FC fragment, your constant region, right? So this FC fragment is bound by FC receptors on things like neutrophils and macrophages. And if it's bound, they're going to try to eat the tissue. So if it's in this case where the antibody's bound to tissue in the kidney, it's going to get frustrated trying to pull up this huge antibody complex that's really attached to something too big. It'd be like, you know, a mouse trying to pull a rope that was attached to an elephant. It can't move that elephant. It's too big. In this case, there's going to be so many of them because they can't get through that we're actually going to have a lot of binding that's going to amplify the immune response further. So all of the diseases that, you know, I've kind of alluded to, you're going to talk about more with your pathophysiology and pathology discipline directors. But I do want to touch quickly on acute post-streptococcal glomerulonephritis. We first talked about this all the way back in host defense, host response in your very first case, Jamie Lopez, who had cellulitis. That's where we covered our staphs and a lot of our streps, including group A strep. Group A strep is also known as Streptococcus pyogenes. Strep pyogenes is the cause of like strep throat. Most of us have had strep throat at some point in our life. It's the cause of group A strep. But it's also the cause, besides just pharyngitis, which is like the actual term for strep throat, it's the cause of like pyoderma and other skin infections. And basically, the thing you need to know is that you can get PSGN, or acute post-streptococcal glomerulonephritis, from either a pharyngeal or a pyodermal streptococcal infection. This is a post-infectious sequelae of strep throat. Now, we talked about other post-infectious sequelae of strep throat. We talked about rheumatic fever and scarlet fever, which is actually still an infectious process, but like rheumatic fever, which is a post-infectious sequelae. Rheumatic fever can actually be inhibited if the patient is treated with antibiotics within 2 weeks of infection, because the antibiotics are going to reduce the antigen burden, which means less antibodies will be made, which means rheumatic fever is unlikely to happen. That's not the case with PSGN. It can't be inhibited by treating the patient with penicillin. It's just something that we note that does occasionally happen post-pharyngeal or pyodermal infections with group A strep. It's characterized by an acute inflammation of the renal glomeruli, and you can see edema, hypertension, hematuria, and proteinuria. It is considered a type 3 hypersensitivity reaction. Once again, we're going to have immune complexes that are basically going to deposit within the glomeruli, and that's going to lead to the inflammation. The good news is that as long as you're able to support the patient's renal function and limit the inflammation, they're going to be fine and it will pass.